Thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar today. We think it's going to be really pretty useful. We're going to dig a bit into reporting training records, and we'll visit some other activities such as suppressing records and that sort of thing as well. But we think this will be really pretty useful. I do have a couple housekeeping things to go through before we actually start into our content. So let me go ahead and pull up the next slide for you. So I wanted just to show you this, just so you have an idea who's on the call today. Of course, my name is Chris Morris. I'm the PRD program manager. And we also have Stacy Smith on the call. She's the assistant program manager. And then we also have the rest of the PRD support team. These are the folks that respond to your questions when you email us at prdsupport@fa.gov. So we super appreciate their effort in helping us respond to your questions as they come in there. So that's who's on the call today. Primarily, I'll be doing the presentation today. You might, if you have questions and things, you might see they get answered by some of the support team because they'll be responding to some of your typed questions. And then at the end of the presentation, time allowing, we will take a few outstanding questions that we see and we'll try to answer them, live at the end of the presentation. So kind of with all that being said, if you do have any questions, we ask that you type them into the Q&A box, which is part of your presentation viewer. And that way we can see the questions live and we can answer them either as the presentation goes, or if we have to, we can respond to them by email, within a few days, because some of your questions are more detailed, requires a bit of research maybe, or we may have to reach out to you for more information. So sometimes we do it that way as well. This presentation, a recording of it, will be available at prd.fa.gov. And eventually we'll also have these slides there as like a PDF file. So you can download the file and you can, browse through the slides that way as well. So we provide that to you so that hopefully you don't have to worry too much about keeping notes and things during the presentation. You can really just kind of take it in and give us any questions that you might have. So let's go ahead and talk about what's on the agenda today. So, reporting training records is kind of a three-step process. So you have to know when to actually report the records. What triggers it is kind of another way to think of that. You need to figure out which training records to actually report. We'll look at that as well. And then, of course, how do you actually report them? That's, kind of the hands-on activity. And we'll go through a sample with that as well to kind of show you how that process works. And then, of course, at the end, we'll look at some outstanding questions, time allowing. So I already have a note down here at the bottom, kind of pointing you back over to prd.fa.gov to look at previous webinars, because although we're going to touch on some of the aspects of reporting pilot records, we did a presentation previously where we talked more holistically about reporting records, and we went into great detail about who can report records, all the different types of records that you report, and historical records versus new records and all those different items. So we're not going to go into those items again super deep here in this webinar. We will have to revisit them just a little bit so that we have some context in case you didn't make it to that other previous webinar. But I'm really trying to point you back over there to watch that other webinar if you haven't seen it, about reporting records in general, because it really covers a lot of the technical background, whereas this webinar is really meant to focus more on specifically training records. So, okay. So let's go ahead and talk about the triggers for what would prompt you to have to report these training records. So the first type of trigger is a historical pilot record trigger. We'll talk about that in more detail. Then you have new pilot records. They have sort of their own triggering item that makes you need to report them as well. And there's also another trigger that can make you need to report records to PRD. And that's if you receive a request via the PRD system to provide a specific pilot's records. So those are the three different groups. And I do want to go into these a little bit more detail. So let's talk about historical training records. So as a reminder, a historical record in PRD is any pilot record dated before June 10th of 2022. So that's a pretty easy demarcation line to say if it's a training record dated before June 10th, then it's considered a historical record. And historical records have their own reporting timeline. And we're going to kind of review that a little bit here. And then if you're like, well, how far back does it go? It goes all the way back to August 1st, 2010. And for some operators, it goes back to 2005. I'm not going to dig into those details in this presentation, but that's sufficient for today just to know the high level. The historical is June 10th, well, before June 10th, back to August 1st, 2010. So we do have some due dates on when you have to report these historical records. So historical record reporting has already begun. Historical record reporting began June 10th. So, the agency understands that a lot of you may have an awful lot of these historical pilot records. So Part 111 says that you'll start reporting these historical records on June 10th, but we give you quite a bit of time to finish reporting. So this next line here, basically, I'm going to paraphrase it, but it indicates that more recent pilot records are due by next June, essentially. And by more recent, what we mean is pilot records from 2015 and forward. So talking about 7 years old. So if the pilot records are within the last 7 years, we kind of consider them a little bit more recent, and they're due in the PRD by June of next year. So, and then the older stuff, the stuff that dates before 2015, is due to be reported by September 2024. So quite a bit of time to get those historical records reported to PRD. So that's kind of one of the trigger items that I mentioned initially when we first started here, is that, what can trigger you to report these historical records? Well, really, it's just this date range, and you get to pick, where in that date range that you actually decide to upload these records. But as long as you've already started with something, you're good. And as long as you finish the more recent historical records by next June, and then you finish the all the remaining older stuff by September 24, then you would be meeting Part 111. So the only thing that changes this schedule is, this is another trigger, is if you happen to get a PRD record request to report those historical records. And really what that means is, a pilot that may have worked for you in the past is now going to another employer, and the new employer needs you to provide those records so they can review them. So there's a process in PRD where they can request those records to you. And we'll look at that a little bit. We'll look at some screenshots here in just a minute of kind of what that looks like. And then that way, okay, well, I planned on reporting these records no later than September 24, but I have a request now for this particular pilot. So you do have to go ahead and report those ahead of time. You can't wait, because we want the new employer to have them, right? So they can look at them. So now the other type of records are what we call new records, new training records. And this is basically just any pilot record dated on June 10th or later. So again, there's that June 10th boundary line. Anything older than June 10th is a historical record, and anything June 10th or newer is considered a new pilot record. And these have their own reporting timeline, and it's 30 days, basically. There's always a couple of exceptions, but generally 30 days is the reporting timeline for all the training records that are generated on or after the June 10th. Okay, so that's another trigger item that would make you have to report certain training records. Okay, and again, new records or anything dated after June 10th. So there is something called a PAC exception to that 30-day reporting requirement for new records. And basically, just to try and paraphrase it and keep it kind of high level, what we call a PAC operator, which is PAC. A PAC or PAC operator includes public aircraft operations, air tour operators, and then corporate operators. Those folks are required to report these training records to PRD. And generally speaking, it's within 30 days, just like an airline would report. But you do have an option if you fall into this PAC group, and your option is you can either report the records within 30 days, just like everybody else, or you can instead decide to just maintain those records for up to 5 years. And then you could report those records to PRD if you get a request, right? So, you might personally have seen that your corporate operation, your pilots rarely move on, and so you're like, well, why am I spending all this effort to report these records when my pilots never move on to another operator, or it's very rare? So that's what this is about. It just gives you that flexibility to report them if you want within 30 days, or you can just hold on to them and and report it when you get a request. There are 2 exceptions, though. It's funny, exceptions to the exception, right? There's 2 cases where you have to always report the record, even if you're in this PAC group. And that is final disciplinary actions that involve removing the pilot from flight status, and also termination records. So if your pilot gets terminated. Okay, so in those 2 cases, you can't just wait and hold that record for 5 years. That record is reportable to PRD within 30 days. And it may already make sense to you why that is, but just the basic idea is, if you don't report anything until a pilot moves on to the next employer, if the pilot doesn't tell the next employer that they worked for you, then how would the next employer know? Right. So they wouldn't even know to come ask you for those records. But these 2 kind of derogatory record types, if you report them automatically, what we call contemporaneously, if you report those ahead of time, then it gives the next employer an opportunity to see that, oh, there's something significant here that we need to look at. So that's the PAC exception. That's probably good. So, and the other thing I mentioned is that, the trigger is that you might get a record request in PRD. And so we speak to that a little bit more here on this slide. You might have planned to report certain historical records as late as September 2024, because the regulation allows that. But you might get a request for records by a new employer, and that basically makes that record due now. You have to provide that record. So there's a couple of different ways that you might get a request for records. So you might receive an FAA form 8060-11 and 11A. Those of you that have been around PREA for a long time, you recognize that form. You've been using that form since 1997. So that's still here. We still have PREA. We have PREA until September 2024, because we're in this transition right now between PREA and PRD. So folks can still use this form. So you might still receive an 8060-11. So if you get an 8060-11 and from a new employer, then you have a couple ways that you can respond. You can either, just like you have for years, you can provide those pilot records the last 5 years. You can provide them to the employer outside the PRD system. That's one way to continue to comply with PREA, just like you always have, right? And so that's one way to do it. Or you have another option. You could instead report those records to PRD. And that's kind of advantageous because you probably have to report those records eventually anyway. So you basically just jump them ahead and say, well, I was going to report these sometime in 2023 because I have until September, but I have a request now, so I'm just going to go ahead and get them in PRD. So that's another way to do it. If you do it that way, it is important to let the requesting employer know that you have provided the records in the PRD system. Otherwise, they don't know, right, that you did that. So that's a couple ways of dealing with 8060-11. Now, the other way that you might get a request for these records is in the PRD system itself. So this is the other system that's the other process that's in the website that allows a new employer to say to previous employers, hey, it looks like all your records aren't here for this pilot and we need to see them. So they could basically make an electronic request. We'll look at that. I'm going to show you a couple examples, kind of what that looks like. But you have an inbox in PRD when you log into the system, and you can look in the inbox and it'll show you all outstanding record requests. And so it tells you, who's asking and what pilot they're asking for and that sort of thing. So the PRD system also sends an email to certain users within the company. I think it sends it nightly. And it basically says, hey, you have this many outstanding record requests. Okay. So part 111 says you have 14 days to respond to a record request. So basically you have 14 days to report those records into the system. This is a good time to mention that this is why it's so important that all the operators to which part 111 applies have actually registered in the system. We have an awful lot of folks that have registered, and that's fantastic, but there are still some companies that have not registered in PRD. If you're not registered in PRD, then the system doesn't know who to contact, right? So it's very hard for the FAA to tell you, hey, you have to comply with this record response when we don't know who to send the request to because you're not registered in PRD. But so that kind of indicates why it's so important. So this whole process, this whole record request process, it's complicated. I know, to hear about it for the first time, maybe. And we do have a couple webinars coming up that are going to focus just on this subject. They will, it'll only talk about how do you request records via the PRD system to a previous employer. And then the other side, how does the previous employer understand this request and provide the records? Okay, so this webinar is not designed to really cover that. We're just sort of giving you a little preview that the function even exists. So if you are wanting to learn more about this, please check the webinar schedule to see the the updates. So I do want to show you, this is what the inbox looks like. So if, and this is available to certain users within the PRD system. Basically, if you have the authority to provide pilot records, then you can see this inbox. So this is what it looks like. This is the inbox, and you can see that you have both correction requests, which we aren't talking about today, but then you have record requests, which is what we have been talking about. This is a trigger that makes you have to report these training records. If you're wondering what's all this background, how does it all connect? So you can see here, there's a column where the requesting entity is called Test Applicant 121. That's our fictitious company. And they're asking you to report any outstanding pilot records for me. My name's, of course, Chris Morris. So that's kind of what it looks like. We'll go into more detail on that in that specific webinar, but just to let you know how that works. So that whole discussion was all about triggers. What makes you have to begin reporting these training records. Okay, so the next thing to think about is we need to consider exactly which training records are reportable. What sorts of things do you need to report? Because the super high level answer is you do not report everything. There's a lot of training activities that you might have records on that are not reportable to PRD. So there is a Appendix A in Advisory Circular 120-68 Juliet. Appendix A is meant to outline all of the different types of reportable training and checking records. Even though I'm just saying training, it includes training and checking. I'm just not saying that. Okay. So we're going to look at a couple of examples and kind of describe how that table is meant to be interpreted. And but you will see that the table has several different little subtables that are used by various types of operators. So if you're a 121 operator and you do training under subparts N and O, then you would look at table A2, because you're going to see all the activities, all the training and checking activities for subparts N and O that are reportable. And we have that for every other applicable group in Part 111. So if you are doing subpart Y training under 121, you look at A3. If you're doing strictly 135 training, you look at A4. 125, which is just checking. Of course, there's no training in Part 125, but checking is A5. You kind of get the idea. Alpha 6, Alpha 7. So that goes all the way down, and each section describes what types of records are reportable to the PRD system. One thing I want to mention here, I'm sure I'll say it again because it's important, is that just because you see a record listed in one of these appendices, A2 through 7, that doesn't mean that you necessarily have that record. What it means is if you have the record, it's reportable. But if you don't maintain that record, it's not part of your approved training program, or it's just not a record that you maintain, then that's fine. Okay. You don't have to generate new record keeping requirements just to report to PRD. Is kind of what that means. So let's look at it at the table a little bit. One item that makes the tables a little bit confusing is that when the table was drafted, it was communicating information both to industry, to you folks, and it was also communicating information to our AIT application developers. So some of the language, when read from an industry perspective, can be a little confusing. So it's kind of why I want to go over it and make sure it makes a little bit more sense. So let's look at an example. Of course, that last bullet is what I just told you. If the item is not listed in the table, it's not reportable to PRD. Oh, and there is also an other record, like at the very bottom of these tables, it'll say other, and it's just so, undefined. And that is really also speaking to our application developers. And that basically tells them that there's going to be an option for other, but that does not mean for you folks that you have to report any other training record not otherwise mentioned. Okay. So when you see other in the table, you can basically just ignore that. It doesn't really mean anything to you as a reporting entity. Okay. So hopefully a lot of you are going, whew, well, it's good news. Okay. So let's look at a sample table. So this is table A3, and all the tables are basically set up with the same column headers. And so we're going to talk about kind of how to interpret this. So the first real point of this is we want you to be able to look at each of these rows, and each of these rows is a different reportable record. So let's look at this first one, this indoctrination curriculum. And we have some things kind of pointed out in the bullet points, but we'll just kind of talk about it. So like the data element indoctrination curriculum, we've used that term because that's the term used by the regulation. The regulation, for example, 121.911 says that the pilots will complete, an indoctrination curriculum. And then if you look to the far right, it has a description, and it says, this is the certificate holder's policies and practices and general knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. So we give you really 3 different points of information there. We give you the basic name, which is INDOC. We give you the regulation on which it's based, and we give you the description. So we give you all that because we understand that some of your training programs might not call it indoctrination curriculum. You might call it something else. But because of the requirements for Part 121 training programs, for example, we know that you have an indoctrination curriculum. You just might not call it that. Okay. So I hope that makes sense. But so you would know that if you have a pilot who begins and or completes an indoctrination curriculum, a curriculum in your training program that's meant to satisfy this requirement, then that item is reportable. Okay, it's kind of what that comes down to. So, okay, I think I've kind of covered the items in the bullet points. I'm not going to cover those again. Let's look at a different column in this table. Let's look at, we've kind of moved down a page, but let's look at the one that says allow evaluator comments. I want to explain this one because, again, it's a little confusing because the term allow, it seems to imply that it's, it's a choice for you folks. So what this means is that, again, it was written kind of to the IT folks, and it was telling the IT folks that when they build the PRD application, it will allow the ability to record comments. That's what it means. So, but I know that's confusing when read from your perspective. So really what we're talking about is, certain checking events will have check airman or check evaluator or evaluator, however you want to phrase it, will have comments from the evaluator. Those comments are meant to be reported to PRD verbatim as whatever was provided by the evaluator. So, the evaluator may have provided comments, they may not have provided them, right? Well, we don't know, okay? So the PRD system will show you a box that will allow you to enter comments, but the comment will be optional. And so in that, the application is not going to stop you if you don't enter a comment, because, we don't know if someone made a comment or not. But it's important to know what Part 111 says. Part 111 says that if there are evaluator comments provided in the original record, they are to be reported to PRD. So that's the real important thing to understand, is that if it says yes in that column and there are comments in the original record, those comments are meant to be carried into the PRD. So I hope that clears up some of that confusion. And then the last column to talk about is the one that talks about task or maneuver, which was incomplete or unsatisfactory. So again, this is only going to apply to certain events. Most training activities will not allow you to report any kind of task or maneuvers. In some situations they may, but the general idea is it's generally for checking events. Like in this example, we have a line check under 121.913C. And if during the line check, the event was unsatisfactory, then you are required to report what task or maneuver was unsatisfactory, right? And you can see that's obviously critical safety information for future employers, right? If the airman has trouble with a particular maneuver or task, then that's really important information to share, right? It's kind of the whole point of it. The whole point of sharing these pilot records, right? So people can identify these weaknesses. So that's what that's about. And some activities that it won't even be present, the box just won't appear because PRD is not meant to take it at all times. So I hope that sort of explains what that one's about. Okay. So we do have some other issues that we see pretty frequently, and I wanted to touch on them a little bit. And then we're going to go through sort of a sample of, how do you report these records? Okay, we'll look at that in the application. So, but here's a couple that we see frequently come into the support box. So there's a lot of training activities that are not necessarily aircraft specific, but PRD requires that you select an aircraft. And there's a pretty easy answer for that. You can just select any aircraft for which the pilot was going to operate for you. So if that upsets your sense of accuracy of the record, and you don't want to have an invalid record, keep in mind that the items that you report to PRD, these are not authoritative pilot records. The authoritative record is what you maintain in your record keeping system, right? So what we have in PRD are really indicators of certain key facts about records. Okay, so because the PRD system insists that you select an aircraft and you say, oh, but this training wasn't really aircraft specific, it's okay to select basically any of the aircraft that the pilot may operate for you. That's fine. and it doesn't change anything about your official record keeping system. So hopefully that helps. We are kind of maybe working on, can we change the code so that maybe certain activities, it won't make you do that. But for now, it's going to make you pick an aircraft. But don't let that bug you too much. Just pick one of the aircraft to which it applies. Kind of the opposite problem is you have an activity that applies to multiple aircraft, but PRD will only let you select a single aircraft. Well, there's a couple ways to deal with this. One way, probably not preferred by you folks, is you could report that record multiple times and just put a different aircraft on it. But really, if the event was satisfactory, that's not super useful. Maybe not a good use of time to make the same record, say 4 times, when just because you want to get different series, for example, of the aircraft. So it's perfectly acceptable to just pick one of the aircraft that was involved in that activity. If the event was unsatisfactory, it's really important that you select the aircraft that was related to the unsatisfactory event, if it was related, if the aircraft was an event. Because just think about the perspective of the reviewing entity, the next employer. Is what's super important to them, super useful to them, is knowing that the pilot had a particular issue in a certain make model, maybe even down to the series, but anyway, so I hope that helps a little bit on that one. Another common issue we see is I can't find my aircraft. I've looked and you've got this pre-made list and I have to pick from the list, but my aircraft isn't there. So we know there's lots of different ways that people abbreviate aircraft, make, model, and even series. And even the FAA has like 4 or 5 different lists, and they're all a little bit different. Okay, so the list that we selected for PRD is the same aircraft listing used in your aircraft authorizations. So this is the same list that appears in op specs. It's the same list that appears in M specs, also in LOAs. So my suggestion is, if you're trying to report a training record, but you can't find your aircraft, it's probably just the actual way the aircraft is being abbreviated. And I would go look at your op specs and see how that aircraft is listed in op specs, because that's the make model code that you're going to see in PRD. If you just can't find it after you've checked op specs or LOAs or whatever, just email us and we'll help you figure out the aircraft. And there have been occasions where there's just an aircraft missing, and we can take care of that too. Okay, so if we discover that, yep, this is an aircraft that's just not in the list and we need to add it, then we'll add it for you. So either way, it's a problem we can overcome. Okay. So this one happens from time to time. You perform multiple events in a single flight. This happens a lot in various training programs. Like you might, this is an example here, is you have a 135 check ride and you do a 293 check and you do a 297 and you do a 299 all in the same flight. And the question is, well, is this 3 different reports? Do I have to report this one time? How do I do this? Well, each of those activities, the 293B and the 297 and the 299, those are all individual rows in that table that we looked at. So if it's an individual row, it means it's reportable on an individual basis. So the short answer is yes, you would have to make 3 different reports, but it's because you're satisfying 3, maybe even more individual reportable training items, to PRD. So, and we are studying ways to see if, well, is there a way we could do that to where you could select multiples, for one report. But we don't have that yet. So for now, you will have to separate those out. I think this is the last one I have from these, and we'll look at the little walkthrough. So this one, the advisory circular says that you have to report the 293A because that's one of the rows of the appendix. However, in reality, a lot of these 293A checks are split into their subparts, right? You might, for example, just be doing A, 2, and 3, on a particular activity. And because that may be all that you need to do for that pilot, maybe the other components of that A check were satisfied elsewhere. So the question that we get from people a lot is, well, how do I report that? Because it wasn't a 293A in total. It was only part of a 293A. It's a great question. And I have a lot of responses there. I think I just want to point you to the bottom response. And it says basically, in other words, it's okay just to select the 293A selection list to report that, even though technically it was really just a 293A 2 and 3. So basically, you're going to have to up level that MPRD. You know, the other side of the coin here is if we had, and I mean, imagine if we had individual options for 293A1, A2, A3. Oh my gosh, the reporting nightmare would be much worse, right? So this is just a balancing act of trying to find the right level of detail that's useful to the next employer versus, you know, the amount of burden we put on you folks for reporting. So anyway, I hope that sort of helps give you an idea. It's okay to up level those to just say 293A, you know, it's okay. So we're going to go through the demo now about how you report these training records. We'll go through a sample. So just a couple of reminders. There's certain folks that can report records or certain roles that you have to have. So if you're an authorized responsible person, you can report records. If you're a user contributor, you can just say contributor for short. That's nice and easy. You can also be a proxy responsible person or a proxy contributor. But one of those four are the folks that can report records currently into PRD. Another really important reminder is that there's no delete function for these records. And that's not just training, that's any of the pilot records that you enter. There's no delete. There is a suppress, which is probably the closest thing we have to delete. And I'm going to show you that at the end of the demo. Finally, these are for actual records. So when you're reporting stuff to PRD, it's not a test system. This is a production record keeping system. And anything that you report is immediately available for the pilot. And so if you're reporting fake stuff or whatever, it's going to create trouble when the pilot logs in there and looks at all those fake records. So we just don't want to do that. So you start this by logging in to the tools button at prd.fa.gov. And once you log in, you'll get a page that looks kind of like this. This is the general starting page when you first log in. And you can see it's going to let you search for the pilot for which you want to report records. So that's how you start. You go to the pilot search function on the menu, and then you type in the pilot certificate number and then the pilot's last name. You don't have to do both first and last. You can do just last name. You can also do just first name, which is kind of handy. It's like a top tip I'll give you, and especially useful in cases where pilots have changed their last names since you worked with them, right? Because maybe you worked with the pilot 5 years ago and the last name was Smith, and maybe last year the name changed to Andrews. Well, you're not going to know Andrews, right? So all you know is you put in Smith and it can't find the pilot. So, you know, that's a good troubleshoot step, is if you can't find the pilot, delete the last name and put in just the first name and see if that gets a match for you. So once you find your pilot, then you hit the search button and it'll show you anyone that comes up that matches the search criteria that you selected. And it's pretty rare that you would get multiple responses here, but it is possible. So you want to look and make sure that you see the correct pilot that you want to report for, and then you click on the view button. And I have there, you know, if you have trouble finding the pilot, just email us and we can help you troubleshoot, you know, a certificate number changes and that sort of stuff. So once you select your pilot, then it opens on basically the screen where you can you can start to see the records that your company may have previously reported. It also lets you report new pilot records. So because we're talking about training, you'll want to click on the training button in the menu, and then that will take you to the training page. And this page is going to show you any other records that your company may have previously reported. Again, this is just records that, basically your operator has reported. But so you can see if, oops, maybe you want to check that you didn't already report this record. Okay, so you could see it there. And it also allows you to start reporting new training records as well. So there's the form kind of down there. So let's look at this form in a little bit more detail. I like to think it's generally self-explanatory, but there are a couple little things that we'll hit on. So you have to do a start date. The start date's required. So if you have an event that occurs on a single date, well, that's easy. You just put the start date and you can leave the end date empty. You could also enter an end date if you wanted to. If it was a multi-day event, like, basic indoc, for example, then you probably didn't do all that in one day. You probably had a start date, and then when they finish that curriculum, and so you would put, both those dates there. Aircraft make and model, I didn't mention that, but we've kind of already talked about, looking up your aircraft. Duty position is either PIC or SIC. Just pick whichever applies. If the training isn't specific to a duty position, then it kind of doesn't matter what you pick. I guess I would just put PIC, it's fine. And then the training or testing program, that's what comes from the advisory circular that I was talking about. So you'll pick what general training curriculum for which you want to report. Oh, and by the way, the system doesn't care if you're a 121 operator. It'll let you pick from anything in the list. You can pick 125 events, even though you're a 121 operator. Okay, so whatever you need to do. And then you pick the training event, and that's the tables A2 through 7 that we kind of talked about. And then you have to pick a result, whether it was satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And in parens, it'll say complete or incomplete. And that's just because, some activities aren't really satisfactory, like a check ride would be satisfactory. And then some other events are just complete. That's what that means. It's the general concept. Was the activity completed or was it not? Then you have the evaluator comments, which we spoke about. Those will only be available for certain activities. If it applies, if the box is available, and there are any evaluator comments, they are meant to be duplicated verbatim here into PRD. And then if it's an unsatisfactory maneuver, then there's another box that opens that lets you specify what was unsatisfactory. So let's say the pilot was unsatisfactory on a instrument competency check because of ILS approach or something. You would write, ILS approaches, whatever was indicated on the form as unsatisfactory, you would type that in there. So, and then you click save, and then it's going to save the record, and it's going to look like this. The next screen that opens is going to show you the record that you just created. So here is this new training record for me, and you could see it was a recurrent competency check in a Hawker. And so you can, now that you've got this record in here, you can edit it. You can, if you check that box next to the record, then you can hit edit. It'll let you, change things about the record, like maybe the date was wrong, or maybe the aircraft was wrong, whatever, but you can't delete it, right? It's there. You can suppress records, and I'll show you how to do that really briefly. So if you want to suppress the record, you do need to scroll this table over to the right, because it's at the very far right-hand side. So once you scroll over, you'll see a column that says suppressed. And it currently says no. I'll point to it there. So currently this record is not suppressed. So it's available for everyone to see. But if you need to suppress it, you can click the add button, and it'll show you this form. And basically you just have to say, is it suppressed? Yes or no. And then you have to say why it's suppressed. And then you click save. I mean, it's really pretty straightforward in that respect. And now you can see it shows up as suppressed. Now, what suppressed means, just briefly, is that the pilot will not see the record, and any other potential employers will not see the record. So it's, as far as they're concerned, it's not there. But you can see it because you work for the operator. You can still see it. And the PRD administrator, we can still see it. So if you contact us for questions or whatever, we can troubleshoot. And you can unsuppress it. You can, it's easy to undo that suppression, which is good. But just a note, this suppress is really not meant to be delete. That's not really what it's for. It's meant to be in rare isolated cases when you're required to not share certain records. Maybe it's a court order, maybe something's an appeal. I don't know what the case could be, but that's what it's meant for. So hope that makes sense. So some kind of closing comments here. Again, you can view and edit records that have been reported by your own company. And I already said this, if you suppress it, you can still see it, but pilots and other operators will not see it. So the next webinar is September the 15th. I think it's going to be super interesting. It's about requesting pilot records via the PRD. This is a recent change. So if you go to prd.fa.gov and you look at the PRDs, you look at the webinar schedule, you're not going to see that in that September 15th spot. There's something else there, but we decided this one was so important. We're going to move it up into there. Those of you that are really paying attention might remember that we scheduled this a little while back, but we weren't able to present it. So, but we haven't now. We're ready to present this one. So, and we think it's super important. So it's going to explain, as a hiring employer, how do you use the PRD to request records? How do you know when you even need to request records? So I think that's going to be a super useful webinar. So make sure you check back soon in a few days to see that updated schedule, but that's going to be on the 15th. So I think we have about 10 or so minutes left to try and take some questions. I've asked Scott Scott's one of the folks on PRD support, to take a look at the questions and see if there's a few that might be of high value to the group in general. Scott, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, I do. For new records, we have multiple crew members without ATPs that cannot be entered within the 30-day timeline. Are there any expected actions we should take?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've heard that one, and the agency is working on a response. The reality of it is there's a technical delay. Just to give a little background to those of you that are wondering, well, how does that happen? When a pilot gets a new certificate, like let's say it's a foreign pilot, okay, maybe they're flying, for another country, and then they want to come to a U.S. carrier, then there's a conversion process where they can obtain, FAA pilot certificates. But processing a new certificate takes time. It has to go through several different eyes. So even though that pilot may have an FAA certificate, a temporary in their hand, that doesn't mean that pilot is in the PRD system yet, because PRD only has awareness of pilots who have been processed and issued an FAA pilot certificate, like the plastic card. That's a pretty good signal. If you have the plastic card, you know that you've been processed by the FAA. If you just have a temporary certificate, you've probably not yet been processed. And that can take about 60 days, maybe as many as 120 days to get that processing to occur. So what this question is about is, as I mentioned, new pilot records are reportable within 30 days. So the problem is that for these pilots, they're not in PRD yet, so the employers can't report that record. So it's a technical issue that prohibits those folks from reporting those pilot records. So we are aware of the gap, and we're working to develop some formal guidance for industry, because I know you're looking for it. So, but we have to get our ducks in a row before we do something like that. So we're lining the ducks up. It shouldn't be too much longer. So I hope that helps that one.
All right. Next question. For the column 3, where are comments entered in PRD? And as a little bit of a follow-up, if the only evaluator comments are medical certificate date and number, should they just include those?
Yeah, good question. I'm going to try and go back to that reporting slide if I can get to it without too much trouble. So let me try and clean this up a little bit. So this is the reporting form when you're reporting a training record. And so if you indicate the result is unsatisfactory or incomplete, then, well, I'm sorry, your question was about comments. If you select certain training events, then this box will open where it says evaluator comments. And, that's a good question. There's some very typical forms used to report these checking events. And there is a box that says evaluator comments, or it may just say comments, but same difference. And so that's a good question. If someone has written other information there that's not really a comment, like a medical certificate number and stuff, I might want to consider that more and maybe think if we have anything that mentions this in the AC, but I don't think we do. I think it's pretty safe to say that's not a comment that we're looking for. We don't, there's no value there for a reviewing entity to see. That's almost like if someone wrote a phone number in that box, right? It's almost like they're writing things in the comment box that maybe they really shouldn't write in the comment box. I think if you look at the instructions for the 804013, it'll tell you what sort of stuff goes in the comment box, and it probably doesn't say phone numbers or whatever. But anyway, so short answer is no, I wouldn't think we want that. We're looking for comments that were provided, if any, relevant to the checking event. Hope that helps.
All right. Next question. If I accidentally entered the wrong number or statement by mistake, what would we need to do?
What do you think by wrong number? What does that mean, Scott?
Maybe the wrong training number, like 135.
Okay, yeah, like the wrong activity. Yeah, it'll let you change that, I'm pretty sure. So you could just edit that activity, which would be this page right here. Let me get to the next page. So on this page, you could just check the box next to the event and then edit, and it's basically just going to reload this form for you. And you can change whatever it is that you may have made an error on, and then just resave it.
Great. Is there going to be an update to the AC in the future, or is what's in place now going to be what we can follow?
No, there's going to be some updates. We have learned a few things since our deployment in June, and we've learned some common questions, some common misunderstandings, and some other edits. So there will be an edit to the AC. I don't know how soon it's going to be. The AC, one of the big edits it's going to need is that it addresses PRIA and Part 111. Well, PRIA goes away as of September 2024. So, by 2024, we're going to have to issue a revised AC to remove all that PRIA content, so that's going to be a big edit. Will there be another edit, a smaller revision before that? I don't know, maybe. It kind of depends on our list of things that we have tagged for correction. To my knowledge, I can't recall anything in the AC that's wrong, but there may be things in the AC that could be better, it could be more helpful. So I guess the answer is maybe. I mean, there will be a revision, but will it be before 2024? Like, will it be next year sometime? I don't know. Possibly.
Okay. And how can I deal with a duplicate entry or one that was made in error? Should it just be suppressed since it can't be deleted?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's pretty much the only option that you have. The PRD system is designed to not audit your input, other than it will look for exact duplicates. So if you enter the exact same record, like same date, same activity, same pilot, same everything, PRD should catch that and say, hey, this is a duplicate. I'm pretty sure it'll still let you report it anyway, because maybe it just looks like a duplicate and it's really not. But if you've already entered it, because there is no delete function, your only real choice is to suppress that record. And you could just make a comment while you're suppressing it. You could just say duplicate record, entered it an error, something like that.
How will pilots receive PRD/PREA records from an airline that ceased operations?
Yeah, that's a great question. You look at how does that happen under PREA, right? Before we had Part 111 and all we had was PREA, if a previous employer went out of business and the new employer sends the request to the old employer, there was no one there to answer the mail, right? Those records were lost, sadly, right? It's just the reality of it. Part 111 and PRD is working to close that gap, because especially once we get past 2024, once we get past September 24, by that date, all those historical records should have been reported. So from then on, records are going in every 30 days, or within 30 days. So if an operator goes out of business in the future, it shouldn't matter because those records should already be in PRD. But, before, from here to then, you're still going to have operators going out of business. That's just the reality of it. And most of them don't have in place someone to continue reporting pilot records. We wish that they did, but and some do. If you haven't thought of that, some companies do arrange for that. And that's great, right? Because we can still get that critical safety information. But it's just a reality of the system that there will be some records that get lost and companies go out of business. But Part 111 should help that, and it should, as the years go by, that should be less and less of an issue. Good question.
If we have records for a former employee that is now deceased, are we required to upload those records?
Yeah, another great question. If you know that the airman is deceased, like you have a certificate of death, like the family provided you a certificate of death, for example, then no, you don't have to report records when the airman's deceased. But that's a little bit higher bar than having just heard it. You heard the airman was deceased. I wouldn't trust that, because you might find in reality that they're not. So I would report those records. The FAA, we are able to tag airmen that are deceased over an airman registry. We don't always hear, as you can imagine. We don't often get those notifications, but that is helpful. So if you happen to have an airman that is showing up in PRD or whatever, and you're like, but this airman's deceased, I'm not going to report those records. It might be really useful to share that with the FAA so that we can understand, okay, yep, that airman's deceased, and we'll tag that, on their file. So yeah, good question.
And
we have maybe one more, Scott, if it's a short one.
Yeah. And there are a lot of technical ones here. So I'm trying to.
Okay. Well, maybe we just stop there. I just realized that we're about to hit the top of the hour. So we'll probably just stop right there. I just want to say thanks for attending. I hope that you found this useful. I imagine there's a lot of outstanding questions, and we will be answering those over the next few days. We'll email you directly with a response. So that's how that'll work. I think otherwise, we can close up here. So thank you all for attending, and please check us out for the next webinar. I think you're going to find it super useful. So that's it. Have a great day.